Yes, another edition of the Learning Journey podcast. Today we head off to Uganda, and for the very first time we're talking to a country director here at MAF. Ruth Jack is her name. Hey Ruth, welcome to the Learning Journey.
Hello, and thank you very much. It's nice to be here across the many miles.
Yes, it is many, many miles. Now I can't go any further, Ruth. I'm hearing a very strong accent. I believe that's probably Scottish. Would I be correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yes, I'm originally from Scotland, but I live in Uganda.
So how did you end up in Uganda? Like, what's the story there? What's the journey that gets you from Scotland to Uganda? I'm sure there's probably been a detour or two along the way.
When I would say, how long have you got? Because I'm not a spring chicken anymore, so it's been a very long journey over many years.
Well, we've got about 20 minutes, Ruth, so we've
okay,
got
so let's
keep
it short. My journey started even before I was born. My grandparents were missionaries in West Africa for 25 years. My dad was born there in the back of a peanut lorry, and all of my uncles and aunt from that side of the family were born there and grew up there in West Africa where they lived. So growing up in Scotland, which is where my grandparents returned to after their 25 years, I was very familiar with stories of Africa, and every time the family got together there were pictures, and they brought out the slide projector. As it was in those days, there was nothing digital, and there was lots of pictures of my father and his family, very traditional missionary looking, with their Panama shorts and hat on, but in their little round huts with their African family and friends. So that was really familiar to me. I was the oldest grandchild, and I always believed that one day I would probably do and live the way that they had lived. When I was 12 years old, I had a very impactful moment when I saw pictures on the television of the Ethiopian famine, and I immediately wanted to get on a plane and go and help, but of course I couldn't at that point. And really since that time, I was expecting the Lord to move me to Africa at some point in my life and fulfill what I felt was his promise to me and his direction to me.
Just wondering, Ruth, so sort of growing up with your grandparents, in the mission field, I'm sure that you heard a lot of stories, heard a lot of testimonies. Was there sort of one or two of those, like in your early years, that really confirmed this promise that you felt God had for you to go to Africa?
I don't remember any particular stories, but I had a very strong, burning desire to help people. I can't explain it any more than that. I thought at first I might be a doctor, and therefore I would go and help people with medicine. But I very quickly became the bossy one in the family. That's what my parents would say, and I was always in charge of everything. It can be a strength and a weakness, but usually if there was a gathering or something happening, I was put in charge of organizing it, even from the age of 12. So it was very easy for me to move into a management space even as a young person and organize things. So that actually became the focus of my career, is management. But I don't remember as a youngster a specific thing about a calling, just a real strong desire and a hunger to go to the developing world, and to serve and to help people. Really, that was the strongest passion, was to help people. And I didn't know how that would happen, but it was just the desire of my heart was to go and help people.
So where did you land first, and how old were you at that time?
Well, obviously, I finished school and I took a gap year, and I actually went to South America, and I did a year living in a country that most people have never heard of called Guyana. And I was the only white person in a village. I lived with a local family. And Guyana is not Latin American as most South American countries are. It's actually more like a Caribbean country. It was a fascinating place for me to spend a year, and I was there to set up a children's home. Which these days is actually not a very trendy thing to do, setting up children's home. But at that point, it was what my church had sent me off to do. I took a big wad of money on a money belt, and I was there from the age of 18 till I was 19. And I was responsible for purchasing a building, having it renovated, filling it with children, setting up the procedures, staffing it. And then we actually had the president of Guyana come and open it. So that was my first foray, I would say, into development and into something that looked similar to what my grandparents had done, but it did light an even bigger passion. It also cemented my faith, I have to say. I was very far away from home. There was no internet in those days. So connection with my mum and dad was down a crackly phone line on the only phone in the town once a month. So my hope had to be in God, and there was nowhere else it could land.
So how do you go from being in South America, setting up a children's home, to being involved with MAF, which is an aviation organization? like they're kind of not worlds apart, but there's this fair distance between them.
So, like I say, it's a long journey, and I went to university. I got married. I was in the oil industry for a while. When we came back to Scotland, I was involved in youth work. And round about the time that my youngest child, my son, was born 13 years ago, sorry, he's 13, I really wanted to get back into my passion, which was development. And by that time, I knew it wasn't mission work the same way as my grandparents. I knew it was going to look a bit different. The development world has become professionalized. So what my grandparents did in setting up clinics and all of those kind of things is now a profession. People set degrees in it. And I went off and got a postgraduate degree in it and went to work for Tier Fund and traveled a lot with Tier Fund. And then in 2015, I came to work for MAF. And my very first placement for MAF was in Scotland, but then I was sent to run a programme in Northern Australia, Arnhem Land. So some of your listeners may be familiar with that. Arnhem Land is probably the most remote place in Australia. And that was an incredible experience. We had a wonderful 3 years there, although COVID hit in the end of our second year, and we were cut off. Arnhem Land became a bubble, a protected bubble, and we moved about freely, but the rest of the world couldn't come in and we couldn't leave. So we didn't see our daughters, our two daughters who were by this point adults. We didn't see them for 2 years because we were in Arnhem Land serving with MAF and running what is quite a large programme there. As we were coming to the end of our time, the senior bosses in MAF asked where I would like to go next, or asked if I would be willing to come to Africa. They didn't say where. And my husband decided that if they either said South Sudan or Uganda, then we would go for it, for lots of reasons that I won't go into now. But they asked if I would come to Uganda. And so we arrived here in May of last year.
I'm going to get to Uganda in a minute, but let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go to Arnhem Land. Talk to me about culture shock. So you've come from Scotland, you've gone to Arnhem Land. That is a big thing in itself. And then you throw a pandemic in and separation from your daughters and all that kind of thing. But how did you cope? Like, how did you get through? What were your strategies? Maybe someone's listening today and, they're about to head into program and they've got a whole bunch of questions and, there's the uncertainty of all that. I wonder if you can kind of just share your experience.
That's a good question. I mean, I had traveled a lot and I obviously lived in the developing world, so I was familiar with what it could look like when it was difficult. Arnhem Land is very, very remote. And if you've been there, you'll know it's also very hot and humid. So that was a bit of a culture shock. But fortunately, there's really good air conditioning in everything. You don't get that. Let me just say, you don't get that in Uganda. We did in Arnhem Land. Again, it comes down to my faith and also my husband. So Duncan is my husband, and we actually took on the role of country director together for Arnhem Land. It's funny because technically speaking, he was my deputy, but in reality, we shared the role equally. And we did it together, and we actually had an amazing 3 years. We loved every minute. We shared an office, we shared a role. We are both very strategic, so we talked a lot of strategy. We made some very strict boundaries, so we didn't talk about work at home or on the weekend, but we shared everything, and we shared all of our troubles as well. So when things got difficult, which they did, we really shared that as well. So he is my rock. He is the one that always keeps me going when things are difficult. He's also very, very strong in the faith and is the one that provides me with Bible verses and prayers when things are also looking difficult. So he's my supporter, my biggest supporter, I would say. Yeah. But then, of course, there is my Heavenly Father, who, of course, is the biggest supporter of all. And I think if it wasn't for my faith and my trust in God and my trust that he had called us to go there, probably sometime towards the end of the second year, I would have thrown it all in. In fact, I actually said to God, either you change something or I'm leaving. And he changed something. We saw God working in many, many ways. And I would say if you are heading to field, the most important thing you could do is get your relationship with God to a good place, because that's what you need. Your water will stop, your organization will fail you, the electricity will run out, you'll wonder what on earth you're doing there. But if your trust and hope is in your Heavenly Father, then you'll be in a good place. As long as you know you are where He has called you, then there's no better place to be.
Do you have maybe an example, Ruth, of where you were in a situation where you just knew that God had your back, that He kind of got you out of, a sticky situation, or He opened a door that you thought was closed, or, something along those lines?
We went through a difficult season as a team. We had to make some big changes in the team, which I won't go into because they were HR changes. But that was a really difficult season. And if you've ever dealt with HR, you'll know that it can be really painful for people. And so we had to walk that line with the most integrity and transparency that we could. And we didn't get everything right, but we did our absolute best. It took its toll. And towards the end of that whole process, we were exhausted and felt a little bit as if we were under attack. And I hadn't seen my older girls, for a year at that point. And I knew they couldn't come for Christmas because of COVID. And I really did hit rock bottom. In fact, you can hear it in my voice, can you? Because I can still feel it right now. And I really did hit rock bottom and just said to my husband, either God changes the situation or we're leaving in January. And I said, we're going on Christmas holiday. We're going to have a break. We'll stop for 2 weeks. And then things need to have changed by the start of the year. And I went on holiday. We didn't physically go anywhere because we couldn't. We were still in Arnhem Land. And for anybody who's had, just as a sidebar, anybody who's used to Christmas in the north, where it's cold and snowy and Santa Claus makes sense because he's in warm clothes, Christmas in northern Australia is hilarious because Santa looks very hot. Anyway, we had Christmas and we came back to the office and something had shifted. God had just moved. Some things had happened in the team. And also some things that I thought were impossible had happened. And also the atmosphere had moved as well. And I just felt that God had answered my prayer and He'd made a way where it didn't look like there was any way. And I didn't feel at the end of myself anymore. I felt like we could keep going.
Now, Ruth, often when we talk about learning, we talk about structured or formal learning, but I think that we learn so much just doing life. I kind of wonder, you've just shared that tough season that you went through in Arnhem Land. What are maybe like one or two things that on reflection, you kind of feel like you learnt through that process or through that journey?
It's a good question. Definitely my trust in God. I don't know if you've experienced this, but you go through seasons where your trust is tested, and then once it's tested, it becomes stronger.
Yeah.
So the Bible talks about refining with fire so that we come forth as gold. And when your trust is shaken, but it comes out the other side, in my experience, it becomes stronger. And I think that was probably the main thing that we experienced there. In terms of learning and development, I learned a lot doing those 3 years leading a team in Arnhem Land that I've now brought to leading a team here in Uganda. I learned the basics of what does MAF do and where do we fly in. And I'm not an aviator, so I'm quite rare in MAF. I'm not an engineer nor a pilot. I'm a manager. So I can manage, but I've had to learn all of the things about what does aviation look like. So I've had to learn a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms in aviation and technical jargon and dealing with engineers and pilots and the rest of it. So I learned a lot of that. I learned about being very clear and very, set objectives and not fluff around. The British can be good at fluffing around and not actually saying what they mean. I've learned to not be fluffy, I would say, and actually speak what I mean. So we have a lot of Dutch people in MAF, and I've learned to appreciate their directness. And I think I've become a little bit Dutch. I would say I've become more Scottish because we're quite direct as well. But I've learned to become more direct, and because I deal with a lot of cultures, and if I fluff around like a British person, then the Ugandans aren't going to understand what I'm talking about, and the Dutch are going to be, will you please just talk straight? So I've learned to talk straight, be very clear and direct, set objectives, set some boundaries, and really at the bottom of it all, if we're not spiritually healthy, then nothing else is going to be healthy. So Wherever I go, I try to ensure that we start meetings with prayer, that our objective and our focus as a team is always on his kingdom and not our kingdom, his agenda, not our agenda. And really focusing on all of this is for him. If it wasn't for our Heavenly Father, then what would we be doing here? So we put him first and foremost.
So as someone who's come into MAF, not from an aviation background, I'm in the same boat, so understand completely. 3 years in Arnhem Land, you've been in Uganda for a time now. What have you kind of learnt about MAF and the impact that it has in programs like Arnhem Land or Uganda?
I've learned how essential we are. We fly planes, and that seems like a fairly basic thing to do. But for many people, it's a lifeline. So for the people in Arnhem Land, if we didn't fly there, then many, many Indigenous children wouldn't get to school. And when I was there, they had some of the first young people graduating from high school, which was a huge achievement for these young people who'd grown up on country, but were able to access school because MAF flew them to a homeland school in another homeland. That for me was wonderful. And, you could just be talking about a couple of people, but they were able to get to school. I thought that was just really incredible. That's a life-changing moment. In Uganda, we do a lot of humanitarian flying. So in the northeast of the country right now, it's not quite famine conditions, but it's very dry. I was up there the other day, and the ground is dry, the riverbeds are dry. There's nothing can grow in the ground. So they rely on services that we fly, people that we fly, to ensure that they have even the most basic health, education. There's food scarcity up there. So the people are close to being food hungry, food poverty. But because of the people we fly, then they are being served. And then Uganda also has a huge refugee population. So there's 1.5 million refugees here. They have an open door policy to refugees from South Sudan and DRC. There is continuing war in the DRC, which means we get an influx of refugees constantly. And although the war in South Sudan is not at its peak, there's still South Sudanese refugees crossing the border. So our services ensure that the people that need to get to the refugee camps can also get there. What we do is the backbone, it's the logistics, it's the bit that not everybody knows about or talks about, but it's really essential.
I just wonder, someone sitting in the support office in Ashford, or they're in the support office in Cairns, maybe they're in IT or finance or HR, they're not on the ground, they're not in program, they're not seeing the work that MAF does day in, day out, like you've described a little bit earlier. I wonder if you could kind of speak to them in terms of the role that they play in helping and growing and investing into the programs that MAF are involved in. Because it's so remote, sometimes you cannot get that sense of, well, the piece that I'm doing is actually so very important for the wider organization.
I mean, the first thing I would say is if you're in a support office anywhere, do anything you can to get out to field, even if it's for a week or two, because it just helps you to connect the dots of what you're doing to what the program is doing. And so when I was in Arnhem Land, we encouraged as many people as possible to come out from the Cairns office or the Mariba base to come and see the work. And many people did. And for some who'd never been to field before, it was just a really important time for them to see for themselves. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is we can't do what we do unless you do what you do. So we can't be the excellent, which is one of our values, everybody. I hope you know that. We can't be the excellent people that we're meant to be on the front line without you being excellent in the back office. So we really do appreciate, and it makes a big difference. I know when I've worked with staff, either in the Cairns or Ashford office, who are just helpful and want to do everything they can to make sure that I can do my job. It makes such a huge difference, and we really appreciate those people, and maybe we don't say that often enough. Probably what they hear more is complaining that something's not working or something hasn't happened. But we really do appreciate, because we just simply couldn't do what we do without the support offices.
Hey, Ruth, I just want to say thank you so very much for joining us on the podcast today. It has been so good to just get an insight to your role, to what God's doing through you and through MAF there on the ground in Uganda. Any final thoughts that you'd love to share?
Just follow what God's calling you to do. There is no better place in the world to be than in his will. So if you are somewhere and you feel God's calling you to something, trust it, pursue it, ask him to open the door. And if you feel you're exactly where you're meant to be, then don't try to go somewhere else. Too many people think that mission is all about being in a foreign country. It's not. It's about being exactly where you are, if that's what God's called you to do. And it might be about being a mission to your neighbour or your work colleagues. That's ministry as well.
Some words of wisdom there from Ruth Jack, our guest today on the Learning Journey podcast. Now, speaking of words of wisdom, next time we head to Canada and catch up with Keith Ketchum. He's been part of the MAF family for many, many years, so he's going to bring a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and some tips with regards to learning for us next time on the Learning Journey. Thanks so much for your company. Don't forget, subscribe if you haven't already to this podcast. Share it with family, friends and MAF colleagues, and we look forward to your company for more of the Learning Journey next time.